So my presentation is going to take just three or four components. The first is actually to unpack social emotional learning and try to make the principles of SEL as simple as possible. I'd also like to emphasize how this can be used as a preventive tool rather than a therapeutic function to address situations like violence and all the aggression we see in schools and in society. And I'll also like to show you, to describe some of the few things we've done in Sri Lanka with significant results and what we are planning to do in the future on this same subject. So first, let me unpack social emotional learning. I know it's a relatively new term. Boils down to self-awareness or mindfulness with the other traits that was described by our keynote speaker, like the interpersonal skills, the self-control, critical thinking, empathy, kindness, compassion, and all those positive mental traits. So, self awareness or mindfulness is, I would like to present as the core or the pivot on which all these other components rest. And I say this with some reason. So, mindfulness is something that came into the vocabulary of the Western and the Eastern developed world just about 30 or 40 years ago, but it's as old as 2,600 years ago. And it came from India, from the Buddha and his teaching. So, mindfulness I want to present as the linking point, the tool which helps to develop these positive emotions and the other positive mental traits that were described. So, what I just want to take you back a few decades actually to show you how mindfulness became the root of all these positive emotions. And this picture shows you in the center His Holiness the Dalai Lama and this famous neurologist, neuroscientist, Dr. Richard Davidson, whom the whole world knows and who's done so a volume of work on these subjects that we are talking today. So this is when His Holiness challenged Professor Richard Davidson, he's a young man in this picture, to demonstrate through functional MRI and other neuroimaging techniques how mindfulness and other positive mental training will change structurally, will change the brain. And that led to the scientific revolution, which Dr. Anandan also described. This also shows how His Holiness took with him to the United States, to Dr. Richard Davidson's lab in the University of Wisconsin, a team of Tibetan lamas, those who have been practicing mindfulness, compassion, and empathy for decades. And he tested their brains. And now we have the evidence of the responses that the brain showed positively. And this picture is really to show this French molecular biologist, Dr. Matthew Ricard, who himself was a compassion meditation trainer for decades and who himself became a subject of that very famous first set of experiments. So all of that went to show exactly what our keynote speaker said about neuroplasticity and the lifelong capacity of the brain to change and rewire itself, and similarly neurogenesis. That means when the brain is taught something repeatedly, there is an ability to change. And this is quite in contrast to what we learned as medical students some 40 odd years ago. We were taught the brain does not change. No neurons will ever generate. So things change, and this was demonstrated by Richard Davidson and his team. Now, this is where I want to show the connect between mindfulness as a link to, for example, critical thinking, prefrontal cortex. This is one area which is responsible for critical thinking, for wise decisions, for sensible organizational management and decision making. So the prefrontal cortex is developed and becomes more functional with mindfulness training. The amygdala, on the other hand, although it's a tiny structure that sits at the foot of the two main cerebral hemispheres, is aroused when detecting and reacting to emotion. In fact, it's called our reptilian brain because we react and not respond. We fault find, we judge, we get angry, become fearful. Whereas with mindfulness training, the amygdala becomes less functional and will become even smaller in size. So there again, connection, what I mentioned. Similarly, the hippocampus, which is really critical to learning and memory, but it also helps to regulate the amygdala. So we see that all these positive emotions, the ability to be more respectful, more tolerant, and not to be violent and react, could come or will come with mindfulness practice. And this has been shown without any doubt through the functional MRIs and the other neuroimaging techniques over the years. So this is just a famous term popularized by Daniel Goldman, that the amygdala hijacks our happiness. There again, I mean, it's the same thing. It's a seat of our most fearful emotions, but a mind trained in mindfulness can manage the amygdala and not make us reptilian, instead make us more human. So I just want to show or share that with you just to confirm the connection of mindfulness with these other positive traits. And what I want to present to you is that I would like to suggest mindfulness can be the seat of a social emotional learning platform. And I'm saying this with a lot of reason. Social emotional learning as a basket of subjects or teachings, I feel, cannot be taught as subjects, cannot be tested at exams, and cannot be graded or, you know, ask students to grade themselves on these particular areas. Our thesis is that with the kind of work we have done, which I will describe in a minute, we found that educators and teachers who are exposed to mindfulness showed for a while, this was an 8-week study, showed how well their management of emotions was, showed how well they were able to be kind, compassionate, and empathetic with their peers and their staff. So let me quickly show you one preliminary study we did when mindfulness was first launched in the school system. It's a program called Sati Pasole. We just tested as a very preliminary study 232 students and 63 teachers who went through some mindfulness training through their teachers. And in the case of the students, you could see these two pie charts, the one on the left, how more than 69% of students talked about their ability to be more composed, ability to work in a more organized manner, improved memory. And if you look at the teachers' feedback, they also gave a similar feedback on the advantages of being mindful, with about 59% talking about the ability to be more composed and less reactive, and also being able to work in a more organized manner. In that same study, yeah, in the same study, we also did a evaluation of the students about how they perceived their friends to be. And there we found that, you know, they found friends with their friends, they were less irritated. There was a better capacity to study, again, improvement of memory. And when it came to the 63 teachers, they showed how the behavioral changes were more positive, so over 70%, with improved attention and academic improvements together. So we found repeatedly, this is a study that was done somewhere in 2016. But since then, with every intervention, we have seen how much all these elements, which we now talk of as social emotional learning, can come through a mindfulness program that is consistently introduced to students, coupled with this set of values like kindness and empathy and ethics education. One, I just want to give you an example of one of my colleagues who was a very senior mindfulness teacher in Plum Village, who mentioned how in a program she was conducting with teachers, how important it was for the teacher's conduct, the teacher's demeanor, the teacher's behavior to be, in order to convey that to the children. So she mentioned when she was doing this training program, it was in New York City, in one of the most a more impoverished area of New York City and a very boisterous school. And this particular class, where this particular teacher who every day walks into class and she's greeted with so much of shouting and boisterous behavior of the students, she was almost giving up. She had done mindfulness practice on her own with kindness practices and so on. So she one day thought of trying out an experiment. So what she did was she walked into the class with a mind jar, which I think most of you know about. It's a jar with water and some glitter. When you shake it, the jar is very turbid. It's like our minds when we are very discursive and cluttered. So she kept the mind jar on the table in front of her, allowed the glitter to settle, and like the thoughts in our mind, which are very discursive, turbulent, so the mind thoughts too settled like the glitter. The first day, only just one or two children decided to follow her example. By the second, third day, every time she walks into class, she uses this mind jar and sits silently and breathes in and out. She found within a week the entire class became what she was, which was settled, composed, and mindful. That was just to give you an example. So I just like to say one country that has really done well in this, and I always refer to the Mindfulness Initiative in UK and the Mindful Nation UK program, which I'm sure most of our people in the audience would know. So for the first time, mindfulness was introduced into the mainstream policy of the House of Commons with bipartisan agreement from both sides of the divide. And they decided to mainstream mindfulness, not just in education, but in the health sector, in the criminal justice system, and in the labor workforce or in labor. So these three universities did the initial research studies, and 8-week mindfulness training was introduced into the parliament. And the MPs themselves were convinced that they got an opportunity, like a window, a policy window, to be able to discuss with their colleagues without confrontation and aggression. So they saw it firsthand how much mindfulness led to these positive traits. So we at Mindfulness Educators, we are also going to attempt a program with Arigato International. It's a program that it's an organization that focuses on ethics education. We are trying to introduce mindfulness with all these positive traits, but without the label of social emotional learning, to educators. We're starting with a pilot project with some teachers and then trying to roll it out within our education system. So here the aim is to make teachers, educators, provincial education authorities understand the importance of mindfulness and these attendant traits, which Anna described very illustratively as firing the Mahatma Gandhi neurons, which was loving kindness, empathy, compassion. I mean, these are all part of the basket of things which are now labeled in the basket of social emotional learning. So we are trying to introduce that. Hopefully, we will succeed. And what I would like to suggest is this in this brief presentation, is to discuss the possibilities of unpacking SCL, making it
SCL-ஐ
a simple process
பிரித்தெடுத்து
that teachers and educators will be
ஆசிரியர்களும்
able
கல்வியாளர்களும்
to reconcile with and
அதனோடு
turn
இணங்கி
into an exam
ஒரு
based
பரீட்சிப்பு
certificate
பாடத்தை முறை
curriculum
இல்லாமல்
in a way
ஆனால்
that
பாடவிதானத்துக்கு
teachers
உட்பட்டு
can integrate
பா
it into whatever subject they are teaching so that it becomes non-stressful. Yeah, so that's all for the moment, Sujata. I'll be really glad to answer any questions on my presentation and anything else connected to what I said at the end of the others' presentations. Thank you very much.